chapter 14 on the water supply, and it is important that we go over this because there's some different ideas, and our friends from Hartley and Armstrong will probably have more relatable. Even Terrell, you guys are more relatable, especially with like the tanker operations, where in the two cities that we operate in, we have hydrants everywhere. So we're lucky in that aspect. But I have a rural history on a fire department, so I know that tankers can be pretty important. And even if we're tiering and mutual aiding with others, we need to know how to do that as well. So we're going to talk about water supply a little bit. The first objective they want us to go through is the ways water supply system components are used by firefighters. There's two different types out there. There's the public, and that's the most common that we run across, but there are some private systems that we also can use for our water supply for firefighting, depending on if we have agreements, if it's readily available, and sometimes that's what they're designed for. We'll talk about an example of that after a bit here. That some places have their own private water supply just specifically for fire suppression, so maybe start thinking about where that might be in our county as we go through it. And maybe you'll come up with something that I don't even have, so. Obviously, there's lots of different locations you can find it. They talk about the ocean. We're kind of in the middle of the country, so it'd be a long hose way to get to the ocean for us anyways. But there's natural or fresh water is the majority of our resources that are available around here. The only thing they talked about is the salination of the ocean water or the salt content and the other contaminants that might be in that water for use for firefighting. Plus, you have to worry a lot more about rust and what kind of components that your vehicles are made out of if you're going to use ocean water for firefighting. Good example of that is we let them use our fireboat on salt water, and we come back and we notice a lot of things were already starting to rust, even though it was used for a short time period versus the fresh water that we use it with. So it does make a big difference on that, even some of the little things. So public versus private water supplies in Dickinson County. Public, the main one that we use, at least here in town, is the municipal water supplies, whether that be in Milford or Spirit Lake, or for us it's Central Water because they cover two towns. And they also are a supplier of water to the rural water system that is in the county. So they provide for actually three different systems or three different services that they provide water for. Other things, of course, we have our lakes, which are nice as a resource for water. There's creeks and rivers throughout the county. For private side of it in Dickinson County, there's private ponds. The big example of that is the ethanol plant. They actually have a berm that they built up, and they have so many gallons of water in that berm, and it's specifically designed just for firefighting at the ethanol plant. They have a pump next to it, and it's designed to pump water into their their fire extinguishment system. I think Brown Medical, they have a private water supply for their manufacturing processes, I believe. So I can't say with any certainty on that, but I believe they also use that water pond next to their manufacturing plant for part of their manufacturing processes. That's why it takes longer for that one to freeze, because they have warm water going back out into it, if I remember correctly. Other sources in the summertime that we can use around here.
The lake.
Okay, the lakes, obviously. What would be other private sources, though?
Swimming pool?
Swimming pool, 10,000 gallons of water in most cases for relatively reasonable of water. Lake Park, when they did their elevator burn, that's what we did, is we dipped into the municipal pool. It wasn't a private, but it was a municipal pool. We actually dipped into that, and we were taking water out of that. And we were filling tankers for half a day and still had plenty of water in that pool that we could pump out if we needed to. So I don't know how many gallons that pool is over there. It's a pretty good sized municipal pool, but big water supply there if we need it as well. So just some things to think about as you go through there. So some other considerations: the amount of water needed from a supply source considers several factors. So this basically comes back to your insurance group. ISO, they actually come in and they look at your water system. How big are the pipes that are supplying the water? What is the capacity of the water? What is the capacity of your water towers? How much water is available to the fire departments? And based on all of those factors put together, how many hydrants you have, the size of the pipes that supply the water, all of those things for fire protection can equate to, if it's a good system, cheaper insurance rates because there's a good water supply system available to you. So that's kind of what these things that they're talking about. Does the system, is it set up for not only fire protection, but for the basic needs of the population that it's supplying water to? So what's the history of consumption and estimated needs? And I forgot to ask, I was gonna call Central Water to see what their high demand in the summer is, but I know it's well over 1 million gallons a day, on some days that they pull out of the lake. So I know that they pull at least that much. I'm not sure, any idea, Mike, or
I know Milford's like permitted for 250 million a year.
250 million a year.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of gallons of water coming out of the lake that's getting supplied into the water systems, and it goes through their filtration system, which is phenomenal at best anyway. So I know we've toured that before, especially when they built it new, and the chemicals that they use and the filters that they use are, it's a pretty neat system that it runs through, and it runs all that water through there. And then the averages of the maximum daily consumption track, the domestic needs added to the flow requirements for fire protection, and then the system has to be capable of supplying both. So not only the water demand in the summertime here, but what could be needed for fire protection at that point as well. So an example of that coming close to being not able to supply both was the fire down in Milford that we mutual aided on. We almost emptied the Milford Tower out because our water guy didn't listen when we called him and said, well, hey, we're using a lot of water out of the tower, you might want to start your pumps and start refilling it again. So we almost drained the water tower. We have drained the water tower in Lake Park and Terrell before on fires. So you got to think about your water supply and where you're at and what the system's capable of providing. So
Can they keep up with that then?
no, not fire supply, depending on what you're using. But no, typically their pumps are not able to keep up with what we can take.
Not even close.
Right. So the only time that I've seen where they can keep up is there's a valve in between Arnold's Park and Okoboji, because they technically keep the system separate, but not. But Neil tells me there's a valve in between that they can open up so we could use water out of the Arnold's Park Tower for an Okoboji or vice versa if we've got a big fire going on.
And those are new. I mean, that was recently added since I've lived in the area.
Okay.
Interconnects.
Yep. So, and that's nice to have that looped system. And then also to be looped in with other water supply systems. So, for example, Bridges Bay, there was finally an agreement made, I believe, with Rural Water where we're looped in with their system too, out there. So it's not just a dead end to Bridges Bay, which we'll talk about in a little bit, can cause problems, but it's looped in so we have more water available to us anyways. So we have the water supply. You could even say that's Westlake Okoboji. The pipe pulls it into the purification plant out to the pumping station. And then here we use a combination system, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And that's what most rural areas use as a combination system. It's a series of pumps along with the gravity feed from the water towers as the combination that we use for water supply around here. That's the most common. So there's means of moving water, and they talk about 3 different ones. There's the gravity system, and typically with a gravity system, it depends on where the original source of water is. They give an example that a mountain lake, if it's up high enough, then the water, as long as it's 100 feet above where the highest point of that's going to use it, it can supply that pressure without having to add pumps or anything else in the system. The coolest example I saw that was out in Colorado doing a touristy thing, but they talked about the wooden pipes. They'd hollow out trees and lay them end to end, and that was our water supply from a lake up in the mountain. And then the water would flow down the inside of the trees and down to the city. I believe it was Colorado Springs or one of those cities that gets the water from that system. And that was all the pressure they had, was because it was so high up in the mountain, it would provide enough pressure to supply the water for that system. Another example out there is they don't have the big tall pedestal water towers like we do around here. They just have tanks that sit up on top of the hill outside of their cities. They don't have to have the extra height because the natural landscape provides the height for the water. They just have to put the pipes down into the city, and that can provide them with that natural gravity to do that feed. So that's a gravity system. The direct pumping system don't necessarily have the water towers or the higher pressure. They just use pumps to supply it. And I believe that's the majority of rural water. They have a few towers around, but the majority of that system relies on pumps, I believe, to provide the water pressure throughout their systems, because it's such far distances in between. They do have some towers on the systems to help boost the pressure, but for the most part, they rely on their pumps to provide it. That does allow them to have a little bit more sensitivity on usage though, too. Okay, I know I pulled 1,000 gallons out once for a fire that I was doing, back when I was in Royal. I filled a tanker, 1,000-gallon tanker, and my phone was ringing the next day. Hey, did you take 1,000 gallons of water out of our system? Yes. You need to call us at Dallas next time. We thought we had a leak. Okay, so they're that sensitive on some of those pressurized systems where they can do it. A lot of the gravity systems too, I think, can do that, can figure out if they have some more water usage than what they're expecting out of it, but not always. So I know they've had some water main leaks or breaks that they're not aware of where the water's going to right away, and there are specialists that can come in and detect that based on listening devices and things like that. They can determine where they have those breaks at as well. And then there's the combination system. Uses the pumps and the water towers to provide that pressure, and again, that's the majority of what we have around here is that combination system with the water towers and the systems that are supplying the water. So piping is a big part of that too. Not only do they look at what is the capacity of the water system, how much can they pump and the things like that, but how is that water fed throughout the cities? Okoboji had an old system until recently where they've upgraded the size of their mains. Okay, so at one point it was like 6-inch mains through the city is what would be supplying the water, which is not a lot of water. Okay, they've updated some of those mains to 10 and 12-inch size for the feeder lines, and then the smaller ones went off of that. Now in bigger cities, they can have a primary feeder that could be as much as 16 inches or bigger than that even. I don't know if you've ever seen some of the news stories where the water main breaks and there's just this flood of water coming down the street in the hills. Some of those bigger cities have 4-foot around feeder mains that are running through their cities, and then they break it down off of that as they go into smaller areas. Secondary feeders, and this is our primary feeders in this area, is primarily that 12-inch size pipe. That's the most common. We have those that run along the highway. Some of the new stuff they put in Okoboji is the 10 or 12-inch size feeders as they go through there. Arnold's Park's about the same. The older parts of town, you get down to that smaller 6-inch and 4-inch lines to the residential areas before it breaks down into a smaller residential feed. So distributors go down to the 8-inch, and then you have hydrants throughout. And they talk about, I think we talk about hydrant distances and stuff in a little bit when we get further in the presentation, but if we don't, we can come back and talk about that. Insurance companies look at that. What are the distance of the hydrant from your house? I get that call probably 6 or 8 times a year. Where's the closest hydrant to such and such address? Usually the answer is it's within 300 feet. Because that's where most of the hydrants in the city are spaced out 300 feet apart in the residential areas anyway, so. Okay. Another component we talked about is the storage tanks, and depending on the size, they can be anywhere from just 5,000 gallons to over 1 million gallons of water in those systems. Some of the bigger towers around here are pretty close to that 500,000 to 1 million gallon sizes. So each one varies a little bit. I know, is it Wahpeton just upgraded theirs? I think they did this last summer. I think they upgraded, and I think they went from like a, I don't know, 50,000 to 500,000 gallon or something like that. So a pretty significant increase there. So part of that also is the isolation and control valves, and they use several different methods to interrupt the water flow. They show you a couple on the pictures up here. So and we'll talk about them a little bit. This one, there's just you usually see the round cap with the water, and then just it's just a square-ended pipe that goes down and they can shut it off. This is most commonly seen with your hydrant shutoffs, and then a lot of your other residential shutoffs are the same way. If they have to shut down part of a system, they may use this gate valve that closes the valve down to shut off a portion, and they try and space those out as well to make it reasonable for shutting off certain parts of the water system, so not everybody's affected by that. So when you hear a water main break and from this street to this street won't have water for this many hours, that's what they're doing, is they're shutting these gates or shutting that part of the water system down, and then the others, part of the system can still use their water anyways. There it talks about it a little bit. It's designed for minimum disruption. They talk about maximum spacing lengths, and this is from the insurance industry and what they want to see. It should be about 500 to 800 feet. So if it's a more dense area, they want it at 500 feet so you can affect less people. And if it's more of a rural area, they can spread them out as far as 800 feet, because then they can shut off less people with further distances anyways, if that makes any sense. So once a year they say those valves should be tested. I can't tell you if that happens for sure or not. Around here, as far as water gates getting shut down, I know some of them do. They're usually located on an easement and below ground, and they're usually marked in some way, shape, or form. Again, it's usually a blue cap, or it says water, and then usually the municipality name or central water supply or something on that cap to indicate whose it's for. Directions for use, you usually have to have that specific tool, that long T handle to shut the water system down. And then there's a couple different markers out there if it's a private system. One example we run into is Jose's buildings. They have a post indicator valve to tell you if the water supply is on. Now that's to the fire supply system a lot of times is what those indicate. So those are the red posts that stand up outside of a building about this tall, and they'll say either open or closed on them. Okay, that's a post indicator valve. If it says open, it means the water supply is open and running to the building so that it will work. If it's closed, it means somebody shut that water supply off. Had a sprinkler head break, had something happen where they had to shut the whole system down. Not just the water supply to the fire system on the inside of the pump room or something. So the other is the outside stem and yoke valve, or OS and Y, is how you'll see it referred to as a shortcut a lot of times. And that's the wheel with a stem that comes out of the middle. So if the stem's sticking out, that tells you what probably? So you got a pipe here, you got a gate, yep, so if the stem's up, that means that gate's open and the water's flowing. If the stem's pushed down in the wheel, that means that that gate is pushed down over that pipe to stop the water flow, so that means it's closed. So that's the OS and Y, or outside stem and yoke valve, that you may come across in written form later, I don't know. So, but post indicator valves are the ones that are outside, open or closed, in plain English written on them. And then the OS and Y has got the stem that comes out of it. Typically, systems between public and private, there's usually a gate or a butterfly valve on it. So the gate has the OS and Y usually, it just closes down. The butterfly is usually a quarter turn, and that closes that valve down that way. Typically, there's a water flow meter in there, so they can tell the volume of water that's going to be used through that system. And there's also a backflow preventer, so that if there's a problem inside that building, that contaminated water can't get back into the main supply system. So usually between a private and a public system, there's those things that are in there. Fire hydrant locations. Again, it depends on the water system, but they're typically located along the pipes. For fire hydrants, there's usually a valve on the main system or just off of the main system, a short pipe that leads to the hydrant, and then your riser that comes up to the bottom of the hydrant. So you've got your main, you've got a feeder pipe, usually a valve in the middle there somewhere, and then the hydrant comes up underneath of there. So you typically, the water's to the bottom of the hydrant, but it's not in the hydrant on our systems, which is the dry barrel hydrant, which we'll talk about here in a minute. They're connected at specific intervals. Again, in our city, it's typically 300 feet. Sometimes there's more. Typically, there's not less than that 300-foot distance between, unless there's some special circumstance. What I'm dealing with right now is the changes that they want to make to the promenade down at the amusement park, or the green space. So we have one right out in front of Bob's Dogs, and they want to move it, I think 50 or 100 feet further one direction or another, which is fine. Okay, so we don't need it right in front of the only building that it protects anyways necessarily, so. And then again, it may require other hydrants that are in there. Typically in larger, metropolitan areas, usually if every building or within one block, they have one. Some things that affect that spacing is what the building is constructed of, how many people are in that building, what the density of the building is, the size of the water main that's available, and the required fire flows. So if we got downtown Spirit Lake, and we've got a 5-story structure right on the corner there of the one building, it should have some pretty good fire flows out of that hydrant there. It should be big, or there should be more hydrants available and bigger supply pipes that are connected to that anyway. So those are some of the factors that can impact spacing if there's been some good city planning done to that point anyways. So friction loss and locations can affect volume and pressure. One thing we talked about already, but is dead end hydrants. So with your dead end hydrants, they're at the end. For example, we had one of those for a long time out at Bridges Bay. Central Water had one pipe basically running out to supply Bridges Bay until we connected up with the regional water supply system, and now we have a looped system. So we have loops going out there, pipes, and they're supplied from 2 different directions, like shown in the circulating hydrant. The problem with dead end pipes is the water tends to get stale in there, and you'll know if you're on a dead end hydrant pretty fast, especially if it hasn't been flushed recently, because that water will stink when it comes out of the hydrant when you flush it. So bacteria, I'm assuming, builds up as the water stays stagnant and builds up the off gases and supplies, and you can tell if you're on a dead end hydrant pretty fast.
Would that be like, I would put some, water main in down in Spencer in that new, the green, manufacturing part of town.
Okay.
On the east side.
On the east side, yeah.
And it was like a 6 foot from the main to the hydrant, but there wasn't anything after that. Would that be a dead end then?
The main didn't go back around, or it's just
No.
6 foot from the main to the
It was
hydrant?
6 foot from the main.
No, that wouldn't be, because the main probably circles back around somewhere out there.
It's just teed into it, so I don't know.
Yeah, so it's probably more of your circulating hydrant. Even though it's got that T in there, that's just a feeder to the hydrant. What they're talking about the system, because as it goes by, there's gonna be some exchange of water there. You'll probably have a little stink, but it won't be as bad because it'll feed out of that main pretty fast. That 6 foot it'll cover. This is at the end of a main, and there's no more main that goes beyond the end of this hydrant. So we have a few of them that are dead ended. 232nd out by Mitch Waters. They have a dead end that just runs straight down out there. But if the pipe if the main circulates back around somewhere, then it's a circulating. If it's the end of the main though, then it's considered a dead end. Does that make sense?
I think it does, but not at a hydrant. I don't think it's just capped off.
It's capped off a little bit further down the line, then yeah, that'd be a dead end. So that's something cities usually flush those more frequently if they know that they're dead end hydrants, just to try and keep that water from getting stagnant. So, good question, Noah. All right, so let's talk about fire hydrants and their markings a little bit here. So fire hydrants can fail, have failed. We live in a cold environment. If the drains aren't working on them, they'll freeze up in a hurry on you, and you won't be able to use them again until spring, until they thaw out anyways. Sometimes maintenance on them is lackluster, so you won't be able to even turn to open the valve on the bottom, because you're talking about water and rust and metal basically working together, so it's harder to get it open. So there may be lots of different things that can cause that. Damaged hydrant valves and connections, broken water mains, greater demand than the system can provide. So we talk about robbing Peter to pay Paul on some of our fire scenes. If there's not a very good supply, whoever's closest to the water source may be getting plenty of water supply, and then we hook another truck over here and it's on the same line, then we'll start starving each other's fire trucks of water and not have the supply that we need. So that's something tactically we have to think of is, where's another feeder coming in, or can we hook onto a different feeder line to try and pull water as opposed to trying to hook onto that same feeder line on that same street. Okay, so going over a few blocks sometimes, even though you have to lay more supply hose out, is something you have to think about, especially at bigger fires. Is it a dead end water main? You should have an idea where some of those are, or your incident commander should. Closed isolation valves. We had one of these actually not that long ago. So we arrive, they pull the cap and they go to crank it on to flush it out, and not a drop of water comes out of it. Okay, close it back down, they head down to the next one down the block, pull the cap off, open it up, flush is fine, they hook the water supply up. Come to find out, we reported to the city, hey, this hydrant's not working, what's going on? Isolation valve is closed. So from the main to that hydrant, somebody shut that valve, and nobody knew why. So that can happen to you as well. Restricted mains caused by sediment and mineral deposits, and then pipes or hydrants that are frozen are a big part of the problems of why your water source or your hydrant can fail anyways. There's a lot of things in hydrants that might be common that you may encounter. Typically they're all made out of the cast iron, so they're all made out of the similar construction materials. Two components are usually standard, at least two hose outlet nozzles for 2.5 inch couplings. Okay, they talk about the steamer connection too, or the 4 or 4.5 inch outlet. That's not as common. A lot of our systems are older, and so they didn't put those steamers or those big connections on a lot of these smaller water systems. So you just have the 2.5s that come off of either side. And we have all types of hydrants, and we even have some different sizes, whether it's 4, 4.5, or 5 inch on the big steamer outlets. It all varies. Like over in Eskerville though, you guys put all steamer fitters on your hydrants. So you know when you pull up, your hose is going to connect to it every time. But around here, we've got mostly 4.5 inch connections or steamers on the ones that have them, but we have a lot that just have the 2.5s, especially on the Okoboji system and the older piping anyways. They all have valve opening and water main connection requirements. The male threads conform with local use. NFPA 1963 regulations require that. The one place you'll go if you've got standard hose and your hose connection won't work, I know in Iowa, is Cedar Rapids. Cedar Rapids has their own connections that are different than standard. Okay, so they talk about standard fire department connections, a 2.5 inch size. We take our 2.5 inch hose, it won't connect to their hydrants, or if it does connect to their hydrants, it won't connect to their trucks, because they have different, pardon the language, but they have bastardized fittings. Okay, they're different than what everybody else uses as a standard. I'm not sure why. When we took our fireboat down there when they were having flooding, they had to give us some appliances so that if we needed to use the fireboat, we could hook up to their trucks with that. So that's the one place I know of. I'm sure there's others, but that's the only one I know of having those different fittings. So, all right. We mentioned the name already, but dry barrel hydrants. This is what we typically have in this area. Again, you have your feeder pipe that comes across here. Typically there's a valve somewhere in here that the city can shut off or turn on with that T valve or that T hydrant or T water opener. They can open the valve or close the valve with that. Water supply comes in from the bottom. There's a valve on the bottom. There's also a drain hole typically on the bottom here. There's an operating stem with a screw on the top. It has a standard size that usually the caps and the top stem nut operate off of the same size wrench, typically. Okay, a few of them are a little bit different. That's why those wrenches are adjustable though, so they're easy to use. When you open this up, the water will flow in through the dry barrel and then whatever opening it has through there. Key thing to remember when you're opening a hydrant, and I know I've talked to you about it before with our hydrant practices, but as a reminder, when you open up a hydrant, it should go at least 10 or 12 total turns to open it fully, okay? And what that does is it covers this drain hole. If you don't open it 10 or 12, you only do 5 or 6 turns, this drain hole is going to be ejecting water out of it. because it has to be open at least 10 or 12, this plunger comes up and it actually covers the drain holes on either side of that hydrant. You'll know if you have a leaky hydrant or if somebody used the hydrant and didn't open it up all the way, because eventually this undermines all this dirt around this hydrant, and that's why the hydrants tend to sink down. Because it undermines that dirt in there and that hydrant starts to sink down into the ground as it goes.
We just cement ours.
What's that?
We put cement around the backside and like a wedge.
Sure. When they install them, they do that.
Yeah.
So,
We couldn't have any dirt that was loose or moved from us. Like it had to be compacted and there couldn't be any moved. And we had to have it in a wedge shape and then we had to pour the cement. And it was a pain in the ass.
just for installing them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Huh. But, so you wanna make sure you crank it open that 10 or 12 turns. Remember, when we're hooking to our hydrants, we also want to, if we have two 2.5s and we're only gonna use a 2.5, or if we're gonna use that steamer connection or that big connection, that 4.5 connection, we should be putting a valve on there, especially if we think we're gonna have another truck coming in that's gonna need to plug off that water supply. Okay, so we have valves on our trucks or in our hydrant bags. Remember that should go on that 2.5. Reason for that is that all they have to do is hook up to that valve, crank it open, and you've got a water supply for your mutual aid department or for your second truck in off of that same hydrant if you're gonna be able to do that. If you don't do that, then you have to crank it down 10 or 12 times, shut the hydrant off, then open that cap, hook up your hose, and go from there. Instead, you should be pre-planning if you're gonna use a hydrant, have that valve on there as habit for hooking up to those hydrants anyways. Okay? The wet barrel hydrants, I don't know a lot about them. I know I saw several of them out in California. It took me a minute to kind of figure out why the valve opener is on the back side of the hydrant. Like, that's screwy. Why is that there? So I started looking up. Well, they're wet barrel hydrants, so they're wet all the time. The supply is there. The way to shut them off, again, there'd be a valve here, but they have water to them all the time. And to open the valve, it's typically if there's several openings, there'll be one here, and then they'll come down further on the hydrant. There'll be another one coming off another direction with the opening stem on the back side of that, and so on and so forth, all the way up and down that hydrant. So there's a big opening, it may be at the top or the bottom, and then the smaller openings may be on top of that at different angles so that they can open those valves. And as soon as you open the valve, then you have water flowing through there as well. Okay? Questions about dry or wet hydrants at all? More than you ever wanted to know, I'm sure. Hydrant markings. We have ours marked in Okoboji. We don't have them marked yet in Arnold's Park. But the important part of this is, depending on the fire you have, how much water you're going to need, is to look for the right type of marking on the hydrant. Now, hydrants can come in every different color. It depends on what the city orders around here. It can be yellow, red, green, whatever the city decides they want to like for a color for a hydrant that day. Okay, doesn't matter. What we have gone around is we put reflective stickers on all of our hydrants in the city of Okoboji because we knew their flows pretty well. We've got to get Arnold's Parks done yet. But if you look at the color coding according to NFPA, I always remember, the way I remember it is like a stoplight. Okay, except there's one hiccup in there, which is blue. Blue is your best water flow. Okay, so I always think of, although it's not, I understand that, but I always think of water being blue. Okay, so blue water equals the highest flowing hydrant that you have, the best hydrant that you have. And then it follows the stoplight colors. Green's the next best, orange or yellow is the next best, and then red. If you have a red hydrant here on this corner, and you've got a blue hydrant on this corner over here, let's go for the blue hydrant to hook up for our water supply. Okay? Some towns, depending on their water supply, for example, Superior, and I'm not putting them down, they're just on regional water and don't have a good water supply over there, all their hydrants would be red. Low flow. and they don't wanna hook them directly to the truck, is the instructions that they get from Regional Water, because of their flow. They have to put them into a porta tank, and whatever they get, they get.
Collapse the lines.
Yep, if they hook their truck up and they put too much vacuum on it, they'll collapse the mains in town in Superior. And that's just the system that they have, so. We're lucky enough, we got a fair amount of blues and greens, we do have a few reds just because they're on older lines, but as they get replaced, those get upgraded, and then you change the color as you go from there.
So which ones did you say here in town are done?
All the ones in Okoboji should be marked, or most of them. We haven't done any in Arnold's Park yet. So we just don't have the flow information that we needed to get those done. But, and it's been years ago, we should probably go back around and check the Okoboji ones again too. So, lots of projects that we can do, but there's always something.
For measuring those flows, because I know that's one of the things that we've talked about here, what's required for that, or what do we have to do on our end?
There's a procedure for it, I can't recall all the steps, but basically you go out to the hydrant, I think you open a 2.5 is what you do, and there's actually a measuring device, and you crank on your water all the way, and then you use that measuring device to determine the flow that's coming out of it, and then that's what determines what the flow of that hydrant is. So there's something you swing into the stream and it gives you a measurement, and then you have to look on a chart and that measurement tells you about what it's flowing per gallon, and then that's what you base your marking off of. So Okoboji tests theirs on a regular basis. I think Arnold's Park probably does too, they just didn't have it recorded at the time we've done that, and I haven't followed up with it. So. Okay? Good questions though. Alright. So, hydrant operation inspection requires specific knowledge. Your water guy's in town, Neil's our water guy here, he's got a pretty good understanding of the hydrants in town. As they learn about the hydrants and things, they start to get more fluent in them, if you will, anyways. There's a little bit of difference between the wet and dry barrel operations. Again, we run primarily dry barrel around here. And then again, you wanna open the hydrant nice and slow, close it down nice and slow. And then as far as listening to it for drainage, is you wanna keep one cap off of there, and you can put your hand over that 2.5 opening to determine if that drain is working on the bottom or not. You should get just a little bit of suction in there. I've had some success with that on good drains. You can actually feel a little bit of suction as you put your hand over the top of it and let loose. You can kinda hear the air rush in. Some hydrants, I haven't had very good luck with feeling the drain, whether it's just that slow or that fast because it drained out that much. So, but that's one of the things that they say you can do. So, is you crank off that yoke on the top, and then you have a 2.5 cap open. You put your hand over that, and you should feel a slight bit of suction on there as that hydrant, that dry barrel is draining out through those drain holes in the bottom of it. Okay. Some problems, I'd say that's a problem. Okay, we took care of 88 of our problems, kind of. So, a lot of digging. So that's been our problem this year with snow. And then I see the cities did a better job of getting at least in closer to them, along the ones along the highways anyways. So dug them out a little bit more for us, which was nice, so. Alternative water supplies and sources and methods of access. So sometimes you don't have that water supply. Rural cities like Superior, you'd have to do a tanker shuttle. You may have to connect in with, if you have a fire in town, you can always ask the ethanol plant, can we use your private water supply? There's creeks and lakes around the area that you may be able to have access to. There's also dry hydrants in the area that we can access. We just have one operating right now near the amusement park or in the green space. But it just depends on what you have available to you. So you got your private water, your lakes, ponds, rivers, oceans, swimming pools, farm stock tanks, rainwater collection. Then you can use those sources, but you want to make sure that you have enough quantity of water, because it's amazing, one tanker is going to take anywhere from 1,000 to 2,500 gallons, or what's your tanker there in Terrell, Carrie? 1,000? That big one does?
That Peterbilt does, yeah.
Okay, I thought it carried more than that. I thought it was like 5,000 or something.
I don't think that much.
No, it's a big tanker, so,
I don't drive it, so.
yeah. So anyways, they can carry quite a bit, so you wanna make sure that you have sufficient quantity of water there. It's not contaminated, or gonna be a health hazard, and then the depth is gonna make a difference on whether you can draw out of it or not, so. There's your draining, your drafting strainer location. They talk about having 2 foot above and 2 foot off of the bottom, and then 2 foot away from the shore, if you're gonna draft with that. I can tell you with modern devices that you don't have to have quite that much room. Okay, you can still utilize a water source even if you don't have that full depth. Okay, that's the old style strainer that we used to put on the bottom of 2.5. It was made out of metal and screwed on the end of the hard suction hose. Currently, we use either float strainers, or the most common is this low level strainer. And this is even a fairly tall one here, but it's similar to what we use anyways. And what this does, it can sit on the bottom, so it's off of the bottom, so you're not sucking the dirt and the mud too much anyways. You still will if it's loose enough in there. It brings it in through the bottom here, up through here, and then into your truck from there. There are limitations on it. We were clearing out water with this first event, and we had a retention pond that was overflowing and threatening a house, so Neil and I ended up taking both the engine and the ladder truck, and we were flowing water. He was using the float strainer on one side of the pond, and I had the low-level strainer on the other side, and we did get debris up into the truck, and it blocked it up enough that I wasn't getting the flows that I was expecting out of it. When I started, we were probably flowing 500 to 1,000 gallons. By the time I got done pumping, because of the stuff that sucked up into my strainer, which the strainer stopped at the truck, but it was blocked enough that I was only probably flowing about 150 or 200 gallons a minute. So just that little bit of leaf debris and sticks and things that float up in there can make a difference. We've had rocks flow up and get stopped at those strainers in the trucks before, and when we've done the dry hydrants before, we've actually had fish bones get stuck in the strainer on the fire trucks before. So it can all make a difference, but you don't have to necessarily have that 4 feet of water to draft out of anymore. Think about your drop tanks and the different things that we pull out of. It's obviously not that deep as we go.
So you wanna park your fire truck on a wooden dock?
Yeah, no, I'm not thinking that either. I was wondering if anybody was gonna notice that, cause that was the first thing I said. I'm not gonna park my fire truck there, so, but good catch, so. Alright, rural water supply operations. Actually, it almost is a whole nother class. Tanker operations can be a whole nother 3 or 4 hour class, but if you ever get to one of the elevator burns, or one of the things where they're flowing a lot of water, go and watch that system. Okay, I know it's fun to squirt the water and get on the end of the hose line, but to truly learn about water supply and tanker operations, just stand there and watch that line with those drop tanks and the transfer of water and how much water the trucks are going through to pump that through there. Just watching a couple of those a couple times, it's amazing how much water you can actually use. So you need to do the tanker operations when there's no public water distribution system, or you're gonna overwhelm it. Examples of that was the downtown fire in Lake Park. We had 2 ladders or 2 sticks up in the air flowing water. We would have never supplied long enough out of that Lake Park water tower. We ended up with our ladder truck with 3 tanks in front of it, and we were able to keep water supplying to it for several hours, just running off of the drop tanks, because the tankers, I think we had 6 or 7 tankers supplying water to us that whole time. So we were able to keep up with the water supply that was needed. Or if your system has inadequate volume or pressure, you're gonna need to set up a tanker supply. So there's an example of it. We got a tank here, we got a tank up here, and then just depending on what you got going on. The most common practice that we see, at least in rural fire departments, is that they're gonna set the tanker out on the road, so that the drop porta tank out on the road, and they're going to run a hose line in from the end of the road to the structure, or to whatever's on fire that they need the water supply for. So there'll be a truck here and a tank here, and then that will push water up to the tank or the truck in the yard, so that, number one, they're not blocking the driveway completely, they're up on the road. And number two, that the tankers can get in there and supply the water. So you have to kind of do some planning, because once these are set down, they're set there, especially if they got water in them. And to move them is a process. So you wanna do some pre-planning and think about how you're setting those tanks up anyways as you do that. So you can see here, this is their hard suction line that's going down into the tank to draw the water out. This one they just must be using to circulate water for right now, and that's a pretty common practice just to make sure to keep the pump cool. It also helps with them keeping a draft. So if you're pulling water out of a tank or getting that water pushed up into the truck through a tank, by keeping some water flowing, you're always keeping water going up that line. Sometimes you can lose the draft if you don't have a little bit of water flowing at a time too. So
You
that
got a
helps with-
strainer on the end of it? I can't remember.
What's that?
You put a strainer on the end of that hard suction or just an open?
Typically on a tank, yeah, you'll put a low level strainer on there,
Yeah.
that flat one that I showed you
Yeah.
most times, so,
Couldn't remember how we did that.
yeah. Okay. So there's several key components when you're doing a water shuttle, and I keep calling them tankers. I'd get admonished by someone in the fire service, cause that's got wings on it and flies. They're tenders is what they're supposed to be called in the fire service, or water shuttle trucks. So, just so you know, but I grew up calling them tankers, so that's what I keep calling them, but. So, you gotta have the dump site, obviously needs to be located near the incident, one or more portable tanks. I think the most I've seen is, 8 drop tanks and 3 engines running off of them. And that was for an elevator burn. So they had 8 tanks lined up, all of them where it could be a dump site for a tanker, because I think they had 16 or 20 tankers lined up to dump water. And then they had 3 pumps running out of those tanks to be able to supply water to do that elevator. Fill site has to be at the water source, so you have to think about where it's gonna be. Lake Park is getting pretty good at it. They've got a couple places that they can go to get water if they need to, for their bigger fires, and that's boat ramps or whatever it happens to be can provide your water. Like I said, we use the pool for their elevator burn, whatever it happens to be. And then you have to have mobile water supply apparatus, and that hauls the water from the fill site to the dump, and those are tankers. And again, they vary in size. I've seen tankers as small as 500 gallons all the way up to the 5,000 gallons. We've had elevator trucks that haul water or haul other materials sometimes that come and dump it. So it just depends on what you got can be used. They recommend on the ground level is to put a salvage tarp down first, and then put your drop tank over the top of that. You want your drop tank to be as level as possible, because even a little bit of an angle can reduce your storage of the gallons that you can store significantly. You'll be dumping it out pretty fast, and even just a little bit of an angle on it can do that. Should allow easy access for your tankers. One thing that I've seen a lot of change in is when we put those drop tanks out, instead of going square or straight in line with the trucks, they're putting them at an angle. So if you've got your fire truck here, getting ready to pump, this is the front here, then instead of putting the tank just squared up with it, with your hose running off the truck into there, what we're seeing a lot now, or recommended changes from some of them, are to take and turn your, because this allows 2 sides for tankers to back into, allows you to do this, to still make your connection here, but allows you more room to work alongside the truck if you need to as well. So it sure makes a lot of sense to me as well to take and turn that tank just a quarter turn, allows for more fill sites and allows more operation room along your truck anyways. So that's one of the recommendations I know that comes out of some of the tanker shuttles that people have done before, so. Okay. There can be several set up at once, and you can do that same thing with them. You can actually angle them each with that. And one thing they don't have on here, but I think is in your book, is make sure your drain is on the downhill side. That will make your life much easier at the end if you can get your drain to the downhill side, so that it'll empty out better, and it's a lot easier when it comes to the end and switching them out anyways, so, Okay? So volume is the total gallons in the apparatus divided by the round trip or the fill time, travel time, and dump time. And depending on who you have filling it, it can be anywhere from 5 to 20 minutes to fill a tanker back up. And then they have to travel to and from whatever site they're at anyways. And that will equal your gallons per minute that you can flow. So hopefully your fill site's close, hopefully you've got a good operator that can fill the tanks pretty quick, and then you can continue your flow as you go from there. As far as unloading your tenders or your tankers, there's lots of different methods out there. The most common that's being put out there is the gravity dumping. The big square tubes off the back, and you can dump a lot of water in a big hurry with those. We used to have an old milk truck that still had the milk truck connection on the back, and that's how we dumped it out. It was a 2.5-inch gravity fed pipe, and it took forever to dump the water out of that tanker. Finally, we got the square tube on the back of it, and it was amazing how much faster we could dump the water out of the tanker on the back of or the tender on the back of that truck anyways. Some of them have jet assisted dumps, or a pump to pump them out. Even that's slow. That gravity dump can dump out a couple thousand gallons in a big hurry, 2 or 3 minutes, depending on how full that drop tank is. You can have that tanker empty and heading back down the road to get filled up again. Some of them have the unload methods on the back and on the sides of the tankers. So they can just pull up alongside and drop the opener down, empty it out off the side versus having to back in. That's a safer method to be able to do that.
Ours is take it, you can turn it, either on the side or you can go on the back.
Can swing back and forth, yep. That's right. It does have the swivel on it, doesn't it?
And
So.
it's 4,000.
Is it 4,000?
Yeah, it's got.
I was gonna say, I thought it was close to 5, but 4,000 gallons, so,
About 3 minutes dump.
yep. So,
3 minutes to dump?
yeah, that's a lot of water you can dump in a hurry, so. NFPA 1901 is the one that requires dumping or filling rates when on level ground. And then used to fill quickly, you wanna find your best fill site or hydrant. You wanna use large or multiple hose lines to fill, and of course use a pumper if it's necessary. We actually had a mixed kind of way that we were emptying out of that pool because they didn't want us to do any damage to the fence. So we actually had one of our grass trucks with a hard suction hose off of that, and we pulled the pump, and we actually were filling the dump tank with that and a float pump out of the pool. Then we had a pumper sitting there, and they would pump it into the tankers. So he would almost empty that tank, and by the time the next tanker pulled up, we had that drop tank filled again so that pumper could fill the next tanker up. It was a good system, but I tell you what, it took some work to keep up with it anyways to fill that way, so.
Isn't that chlorine water kinda hard on this stuff?
It can be, but you wanna if you rinse it out, I mean, it's not any harder
I
than,
guess if it's not sitting in it. so-
right, yeah. So, and it's not really any harder than any of the other, the rural water too, so. I mean, there's some, I'm sure some damage that can occur from that, but if you rinse it out with municipal water or put municipal water back in it pretty fast, it should take care of most of that, so. Okay. This is a self-filling vacuum mobile apparatus. A lot of departments are going to that, I guess. So the old vacuum trucks that you usually see cleaning out the porta pots and stuff like that, they're actually using those for tankers too, so. And I think their fill rate's pretty fast too on those, if I remember correctly. So they can fill them up pretty quick.
Well, that's pretty, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Not sure why that was such a surprise.
Relay pumping. They use that when the source is, when the water source is close enough to the fire, to the scene. So an example of that might be if we had our Mineral City fire again. If we didn't have the fireboat to pump it up the hill, we could have put a pumper truck down there, dropped the line in the lake, and supplied water from that pumper up the hill to the Mineral City fire if we needed to. It just depends on what you got there. But obviously, some factors if you're gonna pump directly from the source is make sure you can maintain the volume for how long you need it. Needs to be quick enough to be worthwhile. When you're setting it up, have to make sure you have the correct volume of water, what the distance is between the water source and the fire scene, what the supply hose size and the amount available, and the pumper capacity. So it's important. If you got a 500 gallon a minute pumper, then that's all you got left, and you put that down the water source, it's not gonna make a lot of sense, cause you're not gonna be able to keep up with the demand of the other newer pumpers. So some other things you have to think about as you go there. Obviously, some of the considerations is it should be apparatus with the greatest pumping capacity should be at the water source. Okay, so if you've got a 2,000 gallon a minute truck versus a 500 gallon a minute truck, that 2,000 gallon a minute truck should be the one at the water source providing the water supply. The friction loss, and then if you have some places that you think you might need, for example, our amusement park and the stores that are down there, if those happen to start on fire, our water source is that dry hydrant. And we practice on it at least once a year. So we know that that's a good source of water for us and how to access it and get to that. So you need to practice with or pre-plan on some of these locations if you can at all, if it's at all possible. Okay? So water supply, the end of that, but water is the primary extinguishing agent that we use. And because fires occur considerable distances from major water sources, we got to develop ways to transport water from its source to the place it's needed. Although we are a two-city department here, we still provide mutual aid on a rural districts. And so that's why we designed our engine with a dump tank on the back. So it can be a 1,000 gallon tank or 1,000 gallon tender if we need it to be. Or we can use it to pump, either way. So that's one of the resources or things that we did with our trucks anyways. Must be familiar how to do water systems, and you have to know about the water sources, pumping systems, and what system we have to distribute the water in our towns. We have a combination system, and we know that we have good water supply here. I know if we go to Superior, there's gonna be a tanker operations because they don't have that. If we go to Terrell, we'll have water for a while, but the tower's gonna empty pretty quick and we're gonna have to switch to tanker operations. If we go to Lake Park, the same thing. If we go to Spirit Lake, depends on what part of town we're in, whether we're gonna have good water flows out of the hydrants. We've run into that a couple times. They got some older systems with some smaller supply lines. The one on Hill Avenue, the fire that we had on that really hot day, we ended up hooking up across the highway because that feeder was the biggest one that we had. Everything else around there was small feeders. And so we hooked into that hydrant system there. So it helps to know the system. I didn't know that, but the chief knew that. When I got there, he said, you're gonna have to go across Hill Avenue because that's my better water supply and I don't want you to take from what we're using. So he knew that, it made sense. We closed down Hill Avenue and we had a better water supply that way. So, and then we actually ended up, I think, supplying one of their trucks with water too on that one, so. And then we should need to know about our fire hydrants in our jurisdiction or our area. The city takes care of most of them to an extent anyways. I know I've had a citizen ask me why we don't flush the hydrants anymore and why the city doesn't do it anymore, so we'll be doing some follow-up with that too, so. Questions on water supply? All right, let's take a break.